Hi, Karl. So can you tell us, just introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what your connection to the quilts is?
Sure. My name is Karl Hayden. I was involved in Dublin AIDS Alliance from 1990 on kind of thing for about 8 years, I think, overall. And during the time that I was there, I was working with an organization called Body Positive, and we were one of the constituent organizations that made up Dublin AIDS Alliance, along with organizations like the Irish Names Quilt. And they were a group that was set up in order to be a support for families and friends of people who had died from an AIDS-related death or from some other circumstances, but were living with HIV or AIDS at the time. So we say that because sometimes people chose not to live out their full life and they would have made a decision to take their own life. And so it's important that we don't forget those people as well as part of the statistics around HIV and AIDS. So the quilts used to come in once a week, most of the year round. Maybe the summer months they would have taken a bit of time off or whatever, but basically they would meet in an informal way. So it was open to anybody who wanted to come in and be part of it. And they were able then, through the process of making panels for the quilt, to express their feelings and their emotions and their sense of loss or their sense of celebration, whatever it was that they wanted to put into their particular panel that was being produced for somebody that had died as a result of living with HIV or AIDS. And it was a varied group, but there was a core element of people who were there all the time. And anybody who knows the history of the time will be extremely familiar with the name Mary Shannon, because I think Mary and David Shannon were the two people who basically drove the whole Irish Names Quilt thing for the time that it was up and running. But there were other people then who kind of came and went at different times, and unfortunately the distance between now and then, I've forgotten a lot of the names, but there were people like Mero, as we called her, Mary, who was somebody who had lost a son, and she got very much involved with the quilt in terms of helping people make panels for the quilts. She also went on to be the first person directly affected by HIV and AIDS to appear in one of the ads that the government did in around about the mid-1990s. We had been pushing them for a long time to stop doing the kind of like tombstone falling over kind of thing, and the kind of dire message, and talk about it in a sense that how it affected people and the sense of loss that there was. And we had, as we were pushing it, the government, the Department of Health appointed an agency who seemed to like the idea of this, and then they came knocking on the door very unexpectedly, I have to say, with a very short space of time to get something together. They were looking for people who were directly affected to maybe participate in them, and they did a series of commercials. And Mero agreed. I approached Mero and asked her would she consider doing it as a mother. And she was a bit hesitant at first, and so we worked with her because we felt it was very important at that time that we don't just expose people to media exposure and leave them to get on with it. So we would have done work with them to prepare them for going and doing something like that, then being with them on the day, and then afterwards just to make sure that they were okay with it. And I'll never forget, I think it was we went to Windmill Studios to record it. And Tom McGinty was one of the people, the Dice Man, who did one of the ads. And so we went into the studio and she went in to do it. And the thing was, she was to look into camera and say particular line to camera, and she kept stumbling and having problems with it. And then she asked me, would I come in and stand the other side of the camera? So she was looking at somebody she was familiar with. And then it took another couple of times, but she got there in the end. And it was hers and Tom's were the two most impactful commercials that went out around spreading awareness of HIV and AIDS. So that was there was other opportunities for people who were involved in the Names Quilt. The Names Quilt had a massive impact in terms of changing people's opinions around HIV and AIDS in Ireland. It had worked very successfully in other parts of the world, particularly in America, and it was as a result of the big quilt display that was put on in Washington in the, I think it was the early, I think it was 1990, 91, that inspired people in Ireland to want to set up something here as well and do it. And there were occasions where, say, for example, there was the annual memorial service in St. Patrick's Cathedral that was organised, and the quilts always formed a central part of that event. And it allowed people to come in and see all the names, all the personalities, all the individuals that were remembered in the quilts, and the love and the work that went into making them. And for the families then to be able to come along and be part of that as well, and see their work on display and see people reacting to it as well, had a very big impact for people. So they helped to change attitudes. They were in situations like that. They were brought out to some schools and colleges at times. I remember Mary Shannon and Dave Shannon were trying to work out a way of displaying them. And I had a friend who was a photographer, and I had just been up with him a week or two before we had this conversation, and he had shown me these photographer's poles that you could buy that extended and locked between the ceiling and the floor and all this kind of, and I said to them, maybe this will work for you, and they were able to get them, and they worked out brilliantly for them. So they were able to take the quilts on tour and that. So yeah, so that's kind of like, in a nutshell, that's a very quick kind of take you through the quilt and the kind of thing that it had, the impact it had on people.
And Karl, you talked about the kind of the tombstone ads and the kind of air of doom around that. Can you kind of give us a bit more of an idea of what was happening, like the kind of overall sense in the public of you know, in the early days of the epidemic and stuff?
So in a sense, the work that I was doing at the time was kind of unique in that we were working directly with people living with HIV and AIDS. But it also meant that we had times when the public contacted us looking for information. So we were exposed to the ideas and the thinking that people had in the general population outside. So I can give you a couple of examples. So I remember one time, it was late in the evening, we were in the office, and the helpline hadn't come on at that stage. The AIDS helpline hadn't come on at that stage. So I was there, call came in. It was an older woman. She later revealed that she was in her 80s. She rang initially to ask a question around the possibility of infection from touching a door handle that somebody had touched. These kind of questions. She rang once, we answered that question. She rang back another 5 minutes later. She had something else that she was concerned about. And I don't want to be flippant about it, because these are real concerns that people had at the time, but to us, they would seem ridiculous today. But this was the culture that we were living in at the time. Her son, according to her, was living a lifestyle that she wasn't in agreement with. And we never worked out whether that meant that he was gay, that he was a drug user, what it was. But according to her anyway, that this would put him at risk of coming in contact with HIV. And so she was concerned about all sorts of things, sharing a cup, touching a door handle, if he cut himself and there was blood, all this kind of stuff. And she revealed that she was 80 odd years of age at this stage. And she said, I'm not that I'm worried about dying from the thing. I'll probably die from old age before the thing kills me, but I just want to be aware anyway of what it was. So that was kind of some of the stuff that we were dealing with. You know, we had incidents where there would be a story would come up every so often about how somebody that was being arrested by the Gardaí was spat at by the Gardaí, and the Gardaí had to be taken away by ambulance to go and get tested for, you know, to see if they had contracted HIV as a result. There was all this kind of craziness that was going on around the time. There was even a story at one stage of a priest in the Wexford area who claimed that a woman had come to him and told him that she was deliberately going out trying to infect men with HIV because she had it. And so, you know, this created a big stir around people. This woman should be arrested. This is attempted murder and all the rest. And, you know, we knew that in terms of risk of infection through heterosexual, even unprotected heterosexual sex, the risk was minimal, you know. And so that was the kind of stuff that was going on. And then on the other side of it, so that was the public and all the concern and fear that there was with the public. But from the statutory side, where you think that we should know better about things, we also had to deal with things like the indiscriminate use of body bags. And so we had issues where we tried to deal with the Department of Health and the hospitals in particular around this, where there was a policy that regardless of the final cause of death, if somebody was known to have HIV, that if they died in care in the hospital, they were put into a body bag and they could not be removed from the body bag. And that body bag would then go directly into a coffin, and the coffin could not be opened. And so families who had traditions of holding wakes where they would open the coffin and let the neighbors and friends come in and see the person, they couldn't have that process. And this created a huge amount of distress for families that they couldn't have this tradition to do. And so it took a long time. We never really got it resolved with the hospitals because they went with the notion of universal precautions, and they took ultimate care always around things. And in the event that there should be some kind of a spill, or that if somebody was carrying a secondary infection that might be more infectious in terms of like hepatitis or something like that, and it wasn't known, and the staff in the hospital and the staff and the funeral directors didn't know that could be a potential risk. So this was a universal precaution that they took, but it did cause an awful lot of stress for people. You know, and in the end, I think what we got was a protocol around where they would explain to families, because up until then they were just doing it, and so the family was caught unaware. But in preparation, if somebody was say under palliative care, then what would happen is the palliative care team would talk to the family about when the time came, what would happen, why it was being done. And because they took the time to explain it, the families had the opportunity then to adjust to that, and then they were able to, you know, emotionally deal with that when the time came.
And a lot of what you're talking about reminds me of now with the COVID pandemic and the dealing with infection and social distancing. And I wonder, when you look at this now, having lived through the whole HIV and the AIDS pandemic and the horror of that, do you see kind of similarities and differences? Looking at
Yeah, I mean, you would think that at this stage, given that we have, you know, most of us have lived through the experience of an epidemic, a pandemic and an epidemic, which was around an infectious disease. Now, not as infectious, and the modes of infection are not the same, but at the same time, having gone through that, and hopefully you would think that people would have understood how infection takes place, but obviously that's not the case. And so you get this overreaction from people, and you get this, we had conspiracy theories as well around HIV and AIDS back in the late 80s, early 90s, about, you know, this was developed by the CIA, you know, this was done deliberately to kill off the gays. There's all sorts of things that it was given to people just because, you know, they wanted to experiment with different types of immunosuppressant drugs and things like that, and they wanted to see how they would work on people. You know, and then we had all the other things about, you know, garlic will cure HIV, and there was all sorts of woo ideas out there in terms of what will work and what won't work, and how you can stop yourself from getting it. And if you do get it, this is what you can do to stop yourself from developing an AIDS or going on to develop an AIDS diagnosis. So there was all this kind of thing that was going on then as well. But you would think, having come through all that, that we'd have a better understanding, or even how viruses work. And yet still, and I know they're different, that different viruses have different modes of transmission and ways of replicating and things like that. But you would think that people would get the basics, but no. It's still out there today, unfortunately. I suppose people will always look for something, you know, it's not just the straightforward, obvious thing. They want something that's, you know, it's more like the X-Files than anything else. You know, that probably ages me when I say the X-Files, but I'm sure people have heard of them.
At least you didn't have Ronald Reagan coming out saying to swallow bleach to try and cure AIDS.
Mind you,
well, he wasn't coming out to say AIDS at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, it took until 1986 when he first mentioned or made any reference or any speech whatsoever around it. Then, and he'd already been in office. That was his second term in office, I think, at that stage. And considering that we had the first cases in the late 1980, early 1981, depending on whose whose version of things you take, not to talk about a thing. Not that we were much better. Like we had problems in this country as well in terms of addressing it. We had a situation where we were trying to promote safer sex practices with people, and part of that in particular was around the use of condoms. And up until 1992, we were committing a criminal act if we were distributing them and encouraging people to use them. But, you know, we were doing it as a health issue. Now, other organizations that were doing it as a family planning issue got into more trouble than we did. We weren't targeted because we could make the argument that it was a public health issue. And so that's why we were able to pass them around to people. But until 1992, I think it was Brendan Howlin, who was Minister for Health at the time, came in after all the lobbying that we had done to try and get it changed. And he eventually came in and just said, this is ridiculous, we need to change it. And one of the things I remember, which kind of just tells you, like, it's hard for people to understand the impact of this. But if you take somebody like who's as well known as David Norris, standing up in the Shannon at the time and referring to Brendan Howlin as Minister for Health, and the same, and equating him to Noel Brown, who, you know, developed the whole stuff around TB and mothers and babies and all this thing that he did. And that was revolutionary in his time. And this was seen to be revolutionary in 1992. Like, I mean, at this stage, I was already going off and participating in European funded programs and conferences. And I'm sitting there with colleagues from other countries, particularly the Netherlands, who were miles ahead of us in terms of all these issues, and it was an embarrassment constantly going there and then, you know, saying, well, why don't you have a program around distributing condoms? And we're going, well, we have to be really careful about doing that kind of thing, because, you know, if we do that, we could be breaking the law. And they're looking at us going, what, a piece of rubber is breaking the law? I mean, what, how is that? And actually, I remember after the law, after the legislation, I think, was passed and we were waiting for it to be introduced, the likes of Spook and that at the time, who were anti-condoms and, you know, anti-abortion, anti-condoms, anti-divorce, anti-anything that was progressive, tried to come out and say that condoms wouldn't protect you. Like, it's the same thing about masks, and it's funny that you make this parallel, because they talk now about masks not protecting you because the virus is smaller than the pores in the mask. Well, we know that the virus has to be carried on something, and that something that is carried on can't get through the pores. But it's exactly the same argument made when condoms came out, that there was holes in condoms that were 50 times larger than the size of the virus. And we had to explain that the virus doesn't have wings, it doesn't fly around by itself. It has to be passed, it has to be passed in fluids, in particular in terms of sexual contact. And they can't get through the pores in the condom. But, you know, it's funny, what is it, 30 years later, that we're still going through that? Yeah. It's crazy.
It's unbelievable. I suppose in that sense, then, I mean, just bringing it back to the quilts, for us, obviously, these are such iconic objects. And like you said, that they were such an integral part of that time and that crisis. And I wonder now, do you have any thoughts on what the future of that should be? Should we continue to display, or?
Oh, I think so. I think we can't forget the legacy. Like, it's certainly, we now talk about people living with HIV in a totally different sense, the way that we talked about it then. I sometimes tell people this and they find it shocking when I say it. Just when I first started working with Body Positive, if somebody came into us newly diagnosed and they said, what's the likelihood, like, what's the outcome going to be for me? If we were being brutally honest with them, we were saying your life expectancy at that point was probably 3 to 5 years. That was your life expectancy. And that could be something at the end which happened very quickly, or something that would drag out over time. It could be that people would go up and down in terms of their health, and that there would be often times when we'd be working with families, preparing them for the end, and then the person would recover, and then we do it again, and then we recover and we do it again. And so this kind of thing was happening as well. So it was an emotional roller coaster for everybody involved in it. And the quilt represents a time that, for a lot of people, brought a lot of shame, because they hadn't accepted issues around homosexuality, sexual identity, gender identity, things like that. Maybe drug use, stuff that was happening, because, you know, it wasn't just the gay community that was affected by this. And we've moved on since then. But the legacy of that still has an impact today. And I think that we need to remember that, and we need to say that we lost people an awful lot of the time through ignorance. If we had been more on top of the HIV/AIDS crisis when it was beginning, when it started, if we could stop being judgmental about it, we learned that about any new disease that comes along afterwards, we can save lives. And that should be the paramount importance of what the quilts represent today. They were real lives. They were taken away too early in most cases. They left, some people left behind family, their own children who've grown up. I saw second generation families affected by HIV and AIDS. So a parent who would have come into us living with HIV, going on to develop AIDS, dying, and then their child, either because they were born with the virus and they didn't manage to shed it at some point down the road, or they themselves got into that circle of drug use or whatever, and they went on to contract HIV, and then seeing them die and seeing 2 generations of family go like that, it's incredible. And for an awful lot of us who are working in the area who weren't living directly with HIV, it was a huge toll to watch that and see that kind of thing happening. And so having people like, and if I can go back and just mention the name again, Mary Shannon, who unfortunately we lost recently, who was so full of life, full of energy, full of love and compassion. And the one thing when you talk about Mary Shannon, and you talk to most people about Mary Shannon, it was her warmth and her love and her care and just wanting to be there for people who were so affected by the loss of somebody related to HIV and AIDS. And she didn't have the skills, like she wasn't a trained counselor, she wasn't anything like that at all. She was just somebody who had concern and compassion and empathy, and as a mother knew what it would be like for another mother to lose a child and all the worries and concerns, and then and she made it a family thing. Like she brought in, she had her 2 sons coming in, Ryan and Christian, who I saw go from this age, to this. Now I meet, I think it's Christian now I meet, because I think Ryan's living in Australia. And I'm looking up at Christian, whereas I used to see him coming in, and he was this quiet little kid who, you wouldn't say boo to kind of thing, and was very much to himself when he came in there, and just how different he is today. But yeah, the legacy that was left behind by the quilts, not just in terms of the remembrance of the people, but also the support that it gave to families, and that is just incredible.
Absolutely.
Great, I think, Thanks very much.
Okay.
No problem.
It's great to hear the insights. Yeah.
Absolutely. Is there anything you want to say as a last thought that you hadn't mentioned just around that time?
Oh, God, there's so many things you could be talking about. We don't make time for the heroes of that time, I think, very often. And it saddens me that so many of the people who were involved then are kind of forgotten. So I mentioned Mary Shannon, incredible human being. Donald Traynor, who was director of Dublin AIDS Alliance for such a long time, and really kind of helped shape the ethos around what it was and what it was about, and his work there, and and encouraging other groups and people to be involved in things, and that man is incredible. Rosemary Daly, who was looked after the Irish Haemophilia Society. And I always tell the story about Rosemary. Rosemary was one of those people who she understood the impact of this situation on people at all sorts of levels. But the one thing that she was particularly brilliant at was when it came to the end for people. And being there for the person themselves and for their family. And the Irish Haemophilia Society members were hugely impacted by this. Although society kind of looked at them differently than they did at drug users or gay men who came in contact with HIV, the impact of it for them was just as real. Many of them were married, had children, they were leaving behind young children, or a widow to bring up the children on their own. But the thing about Rosemary that I always remember was that she had a bag, which was the bag that she took with her when someone died. And it was, no matter where they were in the country, no matter what time of day, no matter what day it was, if somebody passed away, she would jump in her car and go to wherever they were. And she would help the family. Before the undertakers came in, funeral directors came in, she would go there, she would help the family wash the body, dress the body, prepare the body, so that when it came to having them in the coffin, or they're already in the coffin, they were looked as, perfect as they could be under the circumstances. So that the family felt that they had given the person the proper kind of farewell that they could give them at that point. And she was just amazing for doing that kind of thing. Like you don't think at the time, because when you're in these situations at the time, you're firefighting. This issue has just come up in relation to this, so we have to deal with that. But then this issue is ongoing. Some of the things like the condom thing took years to get resolved. But in the meantime, you've got other things that are happening now. You've somebody who's homeless, somebody who doesn't have a cooker, somebody who doesn't have a heater, and it's in winter time, and they're, they already have had bouts of pneumonia. And if you don't, if they don't get heat into where they're living, they're going to probably get it again. There was all these things going on. And so you didn't put much thought into things like, somebody dying and, preparing a body and things like that. But yet there was Rosemary, who was doing it in the background. She didn't just do it for the Irish Haemophilia Society. If it was needed by anybody else, she would do it there as well. So just the heroes that there were around at the time, the unsung heroes that were around at the time, and just the impact that they had on people. So at some stage, if you had the opportunity, it would be wonderful if you could kind of throw some highlight onto those people as well.
Well, I have contacted them both, so we'll see.
Brilliant.
But also to yourself, Karl, and all the work that you did, just to say thanks from everyone, and thanks for sharing your stories today and coming to meet us.
No problem.